I've had a surprisingly high amount of people ask me to do a video discussing the recent 2017 Christmas finale of Doctor Who. And since I had some downtime, I thought I could work out a quickie before moving on to my next big project. Twice Upon a Time has numerous distinctions in terms of Doctor Who history. It's the final story to feature Peter Capaldi as the 12th Doctor, it introduces the female 13th Doctor, and it is the final story to feature Stephen Moffat as writer and executive producer. Stephen Moffat is one of those people you can't even casually bring up in fan discussions without immediately hearing some involuntary groans from someone in the discussion. But personally, while this might be a controversial opinion, I have no particular animosity towards the man. I think people have built up this unhealthy appetite of anger towards this one guy. And to some extent, I guess I get it. Without a doubt, Stephen Moffat has written some terrible television over the years. That's something even he wouldn't deny. But try to see things a different way. When you think Doctor Who, what comes to mind? Maybe it's spine-tingling moments like this. Or maybe it's classic and iconic monsters like the Weeping Angels. Or maybe it's the dynamics of characters like Amy and Roy. Those are just a few examples of things that fans tend to give when they are asked why they love Doctor Who. And all of those things, every single one, comes directly from the mind of Stephen Moffat. You can't have your cake and hate it too. I'm not trying to deny that there are episodes or even entire seasons penned by Moffat that fall below this standard, but I think the answer to why this is the case comes not from any flaw that Moffat has as a writer, but rather towards the extensive weight that exists in his contributions to the show. Stephen Moffat has written 42 episodes of Doctor Who. That is more than any other writer in the history of the show. And some of you might roll your eyes and say, oh, no wonder he's out of ideas. But realistically, it's less that he's out of things to say, and more that most people who tried to do something 42 times would probably mess it up more than once or twice. I don't understand our culture's fascination with using opinions about specific creations to somehow shun or attack the people behind them. It's one thing to discuss the failings that some of Moffat's writing has had, and another to try and act like he's some sort of subhuman with no other legacy. How caught up must you be in sorting people into good and bad boxes that you would choose to somehow account endless praise to the majority of the creations of one man, while also trying to play that his talents are somehow universally lacking? That's stupid. The funny thing is, I think that if Stephen Moffat had stepped down at the end of 2013 like he'd originally planned, this intense animosity, which certainly existed even then, would now have totally evaporated. Not only would most people endlessly praise his writing, I can almost guarantee that people would be saying that he should have stayed on for longer, because that's how people are. Moffat has discussed that he considered 2013 to be a particularly stressful and anxious time for him, and that he decided to keep working on the show after this because he wanted to exit the show on good terms. And in a way, I can totally respect that. Doctor Who is a big deal for people who are given the chance to be involved, because for many of them it's the very reason that they got into the industry in the first place. You can't blame the guy for not wanting to jump ship in one of the hardest years of his entire life. And can I just say that any claim saying that Moffat's writing has lost all potential can be easily disproven by Series 10. The whole run felt like a totally fresh breath of air, and if you have Amazon Prime, then I would really recommend giving it a chance. Twice Upon a Time was not originally going to even exist. At the end of Series 10, the 12th Doctor is killed protecting the passengers of a Mundas colony ship. In only a few minutes, the Doctor loses everything. His closest companion is converted into a Cyberman and slowly but surely begins to lose herself in the programming. His childhood friend leaves with herself before they both kill each other. Trust me, that makes sense in context. And Nardole flees with the other colonists. Safe, but only for so long. And originally, that was going to be it. But Stephen Moffat learned that the executive producer who was going to be taking over from him did not plan to start on a Christmas special, and thus he decided to extend the end of the 12th Doctor's cycle into the special. It's a well-stipulated rule in the Doctor Who universe that directly before the Doctor changes, he has a brief moment of vitality. This is why he was able to visit all of his companions in the End of Time, and also why he momentarily turned young at the end of Time in the Doctor. Twice Upon a Time is set during that peak period in the 12th Doctor's change, when he's still trying to resist the regeneration. Twice Upon a Time aired dead center in the middle of a very politically heated debate about the nature of the show, given the recent announcement that Jodie Whittaker was going to be the 13th Doctor. Many tried to argue that there wasn't a point in continuing the show if it was going to keep changing this much, which is most likely why Moffat chose to use the 2017 Christmas special as a chance to bring back the very first Doctor. a character who left the show in 1965. The revived series of Doctor Who has always been extensively self-contained, maintaining continuity but never insisting that the viewership necessarily keep track of the huge amount of stories that came beforehand. Given this fact, it's quite the oddity that Moffat would choose to bring back a version of the character from 40 years before the start of the new series, especially as the focal point of his final story. Who could possibly be interested in something like that? Oh, that's right. Me. While I've naturally kept up with the show in general since I was a very small child, I can say without doubt that the show was at its best as it existed in the 1960s. That's not an insult to any other versions of the show, and it's not an attempt to claim any sort of fan superiority. It's just that the 60s show is the one that I tend to like the most. And perhaps the most interesting thing about Doctor Who has always been that it's a continuous stream from its first episode in 1963 all the way to today. The old man sneaking into the junkyard in episode 1 is the same person who would later be played by David Tennant and Matt Smith, even though he's certainly not the kind of character who would approve of such a fact. So how would he react to seeing what he would become? And it was this question that led Stephen Moffat to rewind 709 episodes to the 10th planet, where he recreated key scenes and recast the main characters to allow for an interaction between the current show and the version that existed 52 years beforehand.
It's far from being all over.
It's far from being all over.
And it's things like this that really signify how Doctor Who is one of the most unique shows on the entire planet. There is no other program in existence that would even think to do something this advantageous just for the sake of discussing the evolution of a character. Not to say that it's entirely flawless. There's this joke they set up early on where David Bradley's take on the First Doctor says something that would have been fine to say in the 60s but is today offensive.
Older gentlemen, like women, can be put to use.
You can't say things like that.
And I actually think that joke is funny and lands pretty well, but throughout the episode they keep trying to force this into scenes, and it gets to the extent that it just starts being uncomfortable. I get it, guys, in the 60s the companions made tea, but today that's bad. I'm sorry, we're all sorry, can we please talk about something else? Bill Potts is brought back from the dead by some sort of mysterious force, and it almost feels like the only reason that Moffat did this was so that the First Doctor could make an uncomfortable face at the realization that she's a lesbian, but this by far is the most horrible example.
You're an ass.
If I hear any more language like that from you, young lady, you're in for a jolly good smack bottom.
Now, believe it or not, this is actually a quote from the original series.
And you bathe that ankle. What you need is a jolly good smack bottom.
Which is basically a story about the Doctor learning to see Susan, his granddaughter, as an adult. You see, at the start of the episode, the Doctor treats Susan like a kid, and by the end, he's taught. You know what? I have to admit that I'm not fond of the fact that Moffat bringing back one of the original characters from the 60s version of the show has led to me trying to defend some random scene like this. Despite this, I can really say that I'm honestly fond of what David Bradley brings to Hartnell's role. It's not a perfect impersonation, but you can always tell that Bradley has the same thoughts that Hartnell would portray onto the screen. And while the resemblance isn't as perfect as some people might try to claim, it's really shocking how well he fits into the image left behind by Hartnell. There are moments in the episode where the difference between the two seems to just slip away, and it really feels like not a single moment has passed since 1965. The story features a World War II captain being randomly teleported to the exact moment where the 1st and 12th Doctors meet, and it follows their hunt to discover what caused this event. They quickly meet an entity appearing as a glass woman, who apparently brought the soldier there by accident. Bill is resurrected by the entity in exchange for the captain, but all of the characters jump from the ship and run off to the 1st Doctor's TARDIS, which is beautifully recreated to be just about as close to the original as you could really get without one of the walls being made of cardboard. Scenes inside the original Hartnell TARDIS just feel so cozy to me. It just feels so right to see it in high resolution after all of these years. The crew members of the show obviously worked very hard to make sure that their interpretations of these sets were painstakingly accurate. This meant not only seeking out a prop identical to the one built for use in 1963, but also mimicking the numerous barely documented repairs that had been done by 1965. And there's this certain joy to finally seeing it twirling around in the vortex. It just looks so undeniably nice, and I think I will never get tired of looking at it. The group ends up landing on the planet Villengard, which is actually a clever piece of continuity because it was first mentioned in Stephen Moffat's very first episode.
Sonic Blaster, 51st century, weapon factories of Villengard.
You've been to the factories?
Once.
There, the 12th Doctor goes to find Rusty, a Dalek from another Stephen Moffat episode who the Doctor taught to hate the Daleks. During this period, Bill and the First Doctor have a very well pieced together conversation about what he left Gallifrey to find. Here he discusses his curiosity over why good in the universe always seems to defeat evil, when by most accounts evil has the strategic upper hand. It's a very nice moment that is immediately followed up by Bill implying that the Doctor is the reason that good always wins. Which, to be honest, I think future seasons of Doctor Who will be better if the Doctor just does stuff without people always trying to discuss how the Doctor does stuff. Meanwhile, the 12th Doctor discovers that the Entity and the Glass Woman is nothing more than an attempt by future historians to travel back in time to copy the memories of historical figures for proper documentation. And it turns out that Bill is part of that entity, and they all agreed to go back to the point where the Captain was taken so that he can die like he was supposed to. But the 12th Doctor has slightly shifted events, so that the Captain is actually returned to the start of the Great Christmas Truce of 1914. Once you get to this very emotional sequence, it starts to dawn on you that the episode is almost over. A lot of Stephen Moffat episodes are so enjoyable that they feel much shorter than they actually are. So despite the fact that the episode is an hour long, I feel like it could have been twice that length. There's a lot of natural character moments that fill in those gaps, and it's a good reminder that with shows like Doctor Who, the journey is often more important than the destination. The most shockingly honest moment comes when the 12th Doctor has one more moment with the projected version of Bill. Bill, who has all of her own memories and personalities, sees herself as real, and the Doctor, who has just watched the real Bill slowly die in the previous story, sees her as nothing more than an insulting imitation. In the end, both Doctors decide to allow themselves to change, and the new Doctor goes off to fall into the London night, in a story that will likely air near the end of 2018. Twice Upon a Time is the end to many pages in Doctor Who history, and you can definitely feel that in the atmosphere of the piece. The story is most likely an attempt to bring comfort to those who are unsure about the most recent change to the show, and more importantly, to draw a discussion about how far the show has come since it first aired in the 1960s. The distinction between Capaldi and Whittaker comes off as far less severe thanks to this presentation, because the divide between Capaldi and Bradley comes off as much more significant. I think it could easily be said that out of all of the era-ending shows to come out since 2006, Twice Upon a Time works the best. Stories like The End of Time and The Time of the Doctor simply feel so much more hectic and cluttered in comparison, trying to juggle so many things at once. Twice Upon a Time is a story about being prepared to change, and in the end, its simple plot aids in getting this idea across. Overall, I think I can just appreciate so much more about this episode than I can really dislike about it. It's good fan service, it tells a good story, and it makes some good use of some amazing characters. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's all you need.